Why, hello there. Good morning. I think we can call this an English poppy, don't you? Oh, that's hot, as coffee should be. Welcome. I'm Cassidy Cash, and you're watching Did Shakespeare. When you study the life of William Shakespeare, especially if you explore popular routes that people use to travel from place to place, you'll notice on the maps of the streets that there are conduits in the middle of the streets. Most of the maps that you see will not go much further than simply labeling these as conduits, however. Nobody seems to explain what they are or why they're there. Maybe because it's not usually the source of conversation when you're exploring the route, but if you're anything like me, when you saw these on a map, you wondered why they had these little mini towers in the middle of the street everywhere. What are those things? Well, this week we're going to find out as we explore the waterworks system in Shakespeare's England by asking, did Shakespeare drink from a conduit? Conduits, as you may have guessed, were a source of water. That's right. Even in the 16th century, there were pipes carrying water throughout the city, and the conduits was where the water came out. Everybody needs to drink water, of course, and Shakespeare's England was no exception. Getting the water to a place where you could cook with it, drink with it, or bathe in it required that you go get it from the nearest river. It doesn't take long for your arms to wear out carrying buckets from the river back to your house, and necessity being the mother of invention, people figured out a way to use pipes to carry the water from the river to a place where they could pick it up and take it to their home a lot easier. Now, there's a long history of this, obviously, way back in Roman times. They had aqueduct systems and very advanced plumbing systems back there. So while there's a lot that we could cover when it comes to the history of the waterworks, this week we're going to look a little bit at what it was like in the 16th century. By the 16th century, these waterworks were all over the city. They served as places where citizens could get their water by simply walking up to the conduit and filling up a jar. When you look at early modern woodcuts or engravings of these conduits, you'll see that there's always a lot of jars sitting around the base of the conduit. And that's because people would walk up, use the jar to put water in it, and then carry the water wherever it needed to go. Thomas Neville, master at Cambridge College, built the Great Court, which is basically this huge courtyard there at Cambridge. I think it's the biggest courtyard at Cambridge, actually. You can check and see if that's actually true. But whether or not it's the largest, it is very big. And right in the center was this conduit. Trinity Head Conduit served as the main water supply for the Franciscan Friary in the center of Cambridge. The stone roof of the conduit head reveals the age of the structure. Its sloping roof is constructed with slabs that are fastened by iron pegs. The water from the conduit head used to flow into central Cambridge is in wooden pipes that passed underneath the River Cam. The supply was used to feed the fountain in the Great Court. Now that comes from an article that I will link you to in the show notes for today's episode. To find the show notes, you look at the link right below this video that says cassidycash.com/conduit. There's always an entire section of show notes for each video we do here on Did Shakespeare, and that's because there's a lot of history to explore. So if you like what you're learning and you want to learn more, the show notes are a great place to start. According to waterhistory.org, here's what they had to say about the history of water and pipes in the 16th century. London was actually very little to begin with, and it was on the bank of the Thames River. Now, obviously, the Thames was a source of water, but there's also water in the moors just outside the city, and a stream that ran into the city. All of these places were places that they could gather their water supply. Historic London depended on the Thames River for its water supply. Everybody bathed there, got their drinking water there, traveled on it. It was a main river thoroughfare that you used there, so it was a huge part of life. There were also a number of springs outside the city which flowed with what they called good drinking water. One person named Fitzstevens actually wrote about the water, and he said that there are fountains flowing near London with what he called sweet and wholesome water. Now, these springs got overwhelmed as the city's population grew. In London, rapidly, which meant that these natural springs got overwhelmed because there's too many people using them. And so they would end up getting contaminated and polluted. And that's why people like Fitzstevens put so much stock in what was called sweet and wholesome water, because while they didn't have a full understanding of bacteria and viruses, they were smart enough to know the difference between good water and nasty water. So they came up with ways to deal with this, right? They're like, okay, we got more people. We got to come up with ways to get more water. Pipes connected to a spring at Tyburn with the Great Conduit House in Cheapside. The term conduit was used mainly to refer to the cisterns at the end of an entire system. All in all, 12 conduit systems were built in London. They were all similar in design, and the head of the conduit was placed near a natural spring, and the water from the spring was used to fill a nearby cistern or tank. From the cistern, the water flowed through the pipes for a distance of at least a mile or more, and then when it ended, the water was stored in a large cistern equipped with taps for dispensing water. And that's what you see on the maps when people walk up and they get it out. That's the taps. How exactly did they work? Well, getting them distributed to the houses was often done by somebody called a cob. These were people who you could pay to bring the water from the conduit to your house for you. As customers realized that they could tap into the pipes and actually steal the water themselves, they quit paying the cobs, and this was actually a large problem in London where they had legal battles, and that's one of the reasons we know it's a thing, is because the cob industry got mad, right? They're tapping the water in, we don't have a job. And so there was this huge fight over, do we want public waterworks or do we not? And there was a whole lot of reasons on all sides for yeses and nos, and they were arguing about it during the 16th century. There were two men who actually moved forward the waterworks business during Shakespeare's lifetime. The first man I want to tell you about is Peter Morris. Peter Morris applied to city officials for permission to construct what's called a water wheel. It was a set of water wheels and pumps that went under the arches of London Bridge, and the purpose was supplying culinary water. Now, that's specifically water that you're going to ingest, which needs to be cleaner than water that you're going to wash something with, right? Like you wouldn't drink water that you wash your car with today. Well, he was specifically focusing on providing clean culinary water to the residents, and he demonstrated the power of his pump by forcing a jet of water over the spire of the church at St. Magnus, which is near London Bridge. The city officials were so impressed that they immediately signed a 500-year lease to allow him to build this pump and wheel on just one arch of London Bridge. The original ones were destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, but his grandson rebuilt his designs later. So when I say his designs lasted, it wasn't the ones that Morris actually built, it was the ones his grandson replicated. We mentioned Morris first on purpose because the second guy's work became this legendary accomplishment of London, and he greatly eclipsed what Morris accomplished. But Morris's accomplishment came first and was quite significant, so I wanted you to know about him. The second person is Sir Hugh Middleton. I've seen his name written down as Hugh Middleton, High Middleton. Anyway, we'll call him Middleton for the sake of conversation. And he constructed a canal to carry water to London from the Herefordshire springs of Chadwell and Amwell, a distance of about 60 kilometers. It was a huge engineering feat, and they started it in 1609. So this is toward the end of Shakespeare's life. He would live about 8 years after this, 7, because I can do math. And it finished in 1613, and it was this bold and thorough design. They actually ended up calling it a new river. It was like he had carved a river into the city for London's water supply. The building of New River is considered one of the legendary feats of London. It provided a great deal of water for the city, but most people were not excited about having it. In fact, they spent this massive amount of money to put this in place now this is 1613, right? So this is towards the end of Shakespeare's life. He's in his late 40s, early 50s when all this is going on. They only had like 380 people sign up. So basically it's the beginning of what the same waterworks system we have today, where you pay money and the city provides you with water. Well, the residents didn't want to do that, and so they didn't get enough people to sign up. By the time they did get enough people to sign up after convincing them and talking them into it, well, then they had the opposite problem of, oh my gosh, we have too many people and not enough water, and they ended up having to struggle with that. So the whole system was rife with problems of like either not having enough people or not having enough water for the people, and having to deal with legal trouble because now the bargemen are mad that you're tapping into the river. All kinds of fights and great stuff like that went on. But it continued all the way into the 20th century. It was not until 1904 that the company passed control of London's water supply over to the Metropolitan Water Board. To me, that is amazing. That is incredible. The system that was started when Shakespeare was in his 50s lasted until the 20th century. That's insane to me. In fact, it's a pretty nice link to Shakespeare's life, if you ask me. For its time, the development of things like conduits and water systems in the 16th century were an explosion of massive innovation, not just for England, but for the world. These systems' longevity and the scope with which they served the city is truly impressive. Shakespeare's lifetime was awash with mechanical ingenuity, which is a great part of what the conduits represent. And I hope you think of that next time you see them on one of your historical maps. Download one of these maps. I've drawn one that shows the route for the Lord Mayor's show in 1613, including 2 of these conduits we mentioned in today's episode. You can download that for free by joining our email list here at That Shakespeare Life. Find all of that and more history, including pictures, at castycash.com/conduit. That's it for this week. I'm Casty Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.